Yeah. Go on, turn around, that's it. Handsome man, look at that.
A heavy iron key to a 250-year-old French convent sat entirely useless in a Parisian apartment, locking a man out of the very stone walls he had spent years rebuilding by hand. The man holding that key was not the owner of the massive religious complex. He was not a wealthy international investor, nor was he the architect of some grand European real estate empire trying to flip a historic property for a quick profit. He was simply a former bartender who had traded the chaotic, neon-lit nights of pouring drinks in the city for the grueling, dusty reality of hauling heavy stones in the rural French countryside. Over a span of just a few years, he had inadvertently become the undisputed heart of a massively popular, incredibly lucrative corner of the internet known as the Chateauverse. But in early 2026, the quiet, satisfying rhythm of his life and the digital ecosystem that watched his every move shattered with the force of a sudden, devastating earthquake. For years, millions of people had tuned in faithfully to watch the slow, romantic restoration of forgotten French architecture. It is an incredibly seductive genre of digital storytelling, one that algorithmically traps viewers in a loop of deep psychological comfort. You take a crumbling, majestic building, something weighed down by centuries of history, rocked, and neglect, and you follow a group of seemingly charming people as they bring it back to life. You watch them mix endless buckets of lime mortar, replace rotting oak timber joists, and slowly, painstakingly peel back the decay to reveal the breathtaking beauty underneath.
It feels immensely productive just to watch it. It feels wholesome. It offers the audience a profound sense of digital refuge, a curated world where hard, honest physical labor always yields visible, deeply satisfying results. You do not have to worry about the complexities of modern life when you are watching a man carefully restore a slate roof on a 19th century hunting lodge. But beneath that cozy aesthetic, beneath the drone shots of rolling green hills and the time lapses of plaster drying, a completely different, highly volatile reality was playing out off camera. The dream of bringing a massive old building back to life is incredibly fragile. It relies significantly less on the structural integrity of ancient stone and much more on the invisible, highly precarious foundation of human trust, financial leverage, and deeply complicated personal relationships. When those human elements fracture, the narrative does not just bend, it collapses entirely, taking everything down with it. The story of this particular collapse centers on a creator known to his fans as Yanis, or Yanis The Home Wrecker, a tongue-in-cheek moniker that would eventually feel ironically tragic given the circumstances of his exile. His sudden, jarring removal from the Convent project was not just a minor scheduling dispute or a temporary hiatus to let tempers cool down.
It was a brutal, physical manifestation of a massive behind-the-scenes rupture that wiped out a collaborative dream and tore a family empire apart. The audience, heavily accustomed to watching walls being carefully repaired, was suddenly forced to watch reputations being rapidly dismantled. They had to parse through deleted videos, cryptic silences, and explosive comment section diplomacy, trying desperately to understand how a tight-knit community built on shared labor could turn so intensely cold so fast. The restoration of historic buildings had officially taken a back seat to the reconstruction of shattered alliances. And right in the middle of it all was Yanis, a man whose only crime seemed to be showing up, working harder than anyone else on the property, and getting caught completely exposed in the crossfire of a deeply toxic domestic dissolution. To understand the sheer magnitude of this fallout and why it felt like a personal betrayal to hundreds of thousands of viewers, we have to look closely at the unique architecture of the Chateauverse, and specifically the empire built by Billy Petherick and Gwendoline Mouchel. Long before Yanis ever picked up a sledgehammer on camera, Billy and Gwendoline were the undisputed royalty of this particular digital niche. In 2016, they made a massive, life-altering gamble, they purchased Château de la Basmaignée, a sprawling, intimidating neo-Gothic hunting lodge located deep in the rural Mayenne region of France. They bought it for roughly €1.05 million.
It was a staggering, visually arresting property, but it was also entirely devoid of basic modern comforts. There was no electricity running through its cavernous halls. There was no running water. It was a beautiful, freezing, empty shell of a building surrounded by overgrown brambles and decades of neglect. The dynamic between Billy and Gwendoline was the powerful engine that drove their subsequent rise to international internet fame. Billy was a former soldier from the United Kingdom. He deliberately positioned himself as the rugged visionary, the tireless builder, the man who was completely unafraid to tackle the endless, bone-crushing physical labor required to make a ruined chateau actually livable. Gwendoline, known to the audience affectionately as Gwen, provided the silent, massive financial bedrock for the entire operation. She is a French heiress, deeply connected to the massive Lesaffre yeast fortune, an industrial baking yeast empire that quietly funded the enormous capital required to undertake such colossal, highly risky real estate projects. While Billy provided the daily sweat equity, the construction know-how, and the charismatic, engaging on-camera presence, Gwen actually held the deeds. She owned the land. She owned the ancient stone. She owned the very ground they walked on. Into this highly structured, immensely wealthy ecosystem walked Yanis.
He did not arrive as a seasoned contractor looking for a lucrative gig. He did not arrive as an ambitious, calculating influencer looking to leech off their massive subscriber count to launch his own brand. He arrived completely organically, simply as a friend of a friend. He was originally brought into their orbit through Mo, a man who was dating Billy's sister Sadie at the time. Yanis was living a completely different, highly stressful life in Paris, working long, demanding, exhausting shifts as a bartender. He would come out to the Mayenne countryside just to visit, just to get away from the relentless, suffocating pace of the city and breathe some fresh air. But Yanis possessed a rare, undeniable quality that you simply cannot manufacture for a camera lens. He had an unrelenting, almost pathological work ethic. When he visited the sprawling Château estate, he didn't just sit around enjoying the rural scenery or drinking wine on the terrace. He instinctively picked up a shovel. He started tending to the horses. He looked around, asked what needed to be fixed, and then he simply went and fixed it, without asking for permission or praise. He was consistently polite, deeply humble, and entirely unfazed by the sheer, filthy grit of the work. Billy and Gwendoline, navigating the overwhelming pressure of restoring a €1 million ruin, recognized his immense value immediately. They saw a man who was willing to bleed for the project, without demanding the spotlight, and they officially brought him on board as a full-time caretaker and laborer.
That single decision completely changed the trajectory of everyone involved in the estate. Yanis transitioned rapidly from a peripheral, helpful weekend guest into the essential, beating lifeblood of the property. He moved into the background of their daily vlogs, a quiet, hyper-focused blur of motion, carrying heavy timber, mixing huge vats of plaster, and steadily pushing the brutal work forward while the larger, louder personalities drove the primary narrative. The YouTube audience immediately gravitated toward Yanis. There is a very specific, undeniable magnetism to someone who does the hardest, ugliest work without complaining. Someone who seems genuinely, deeply grateful just to be given the opportunity to learn a complex trade. In an internet landscape entirely saturated with people desperate for attention, people faking enthusiasm for views, Yanis stood out precisely because he wasn't looking for the camera. He was looking at the wall he was building. As the main channel grew to astronomical heights, fueled by the algorithm's love for dramatic transformations, so did the unchecked ambition of the Petherick Mouchel enterprise. Having established the chateau as a massive, functional success, they decided to level up.
They pushed their chips to the center of the table and purchased a 250-year-old stone convent in Ernée, a massive, imposing religious complex that had once been home to an order of Benedictine nuns. They bought it for roughly €425,000. This was not a cute, manageable countryside cottage with quaint character. It was a terrifying labyrinth of a chapel,
freezing old dormitories, heavy crumbling stone walls, and endless dark corridors, built centuries ago and left sitting completely abandoned for years. And exactly like the chateau before it, it came with immense history and absolutely zero modern comforts. It was at this freezing, derelict convent that Yanis truly found his calling and captured the absolute devotion of the audience. He was tasked with entirely renovating a massive apartment within the complex, and the viewers got to watch something incredibly rare in modern digital media. They got to watch a man learn a highly technical, physically punishing craft in real time. Yanis became the ultimate digital proxy for every single viewer sitting in a fluorescent-lit cubicle, dreaming desperately of trading their pointless spreadsheet for a heavy toolbox. He shadowed experienced, hardened tradesmen on the site, most notably a man named Simon the Builder. The dynamic between Yanis and Simon quickly became legendary among the fanbase. Simon was a seasoned, tough veteran of French construction, a man who knew the complicated language of historic stone, lime rendering, and ancient mortar fluently. Yanis was the eager, relentless apprentice.
Their daily interactions were filled with good-natured, foul-mouthed banter, impromptu singing to break the tension, and a deep, unspoken mutual respect. Watching Yanis shadow Simon turned the channel into a masterclass in the harsh reality of the daily grind. His appeal was never about the polished, Pinterest-perfect, aesthetically pleasing final finishes. It was entirely about the thick, white dust constantly clinging to his clothes, the sweat dripping off his brow in the summer heat, and the relentless, frustrating trial and error of the actual work. Recognizing his immense, surging popularity with the audience, Billy Petherick made a move that, at the time, seemed like a gesture of profound, brotherly support. He handed Yanis a camera. He actively encouraged him to start his own solo channel, specifically documenting his personal journey of renovating the convent apartment from a state of ruin to a livable space. The channel was playfully, perhaps ominously named Yanis The Home Wrecker, a clever nod to his initial role in heavy demolition, tearing down the rotten, collapsing interiors of the old buildings to make way for the new. The solo channel exploded almost overnight.
It didn't just succeed because Yanis was already a familiar, beloved face in the Chateauverse. It succeeded wildly because it offered a level of raw intimacy and honesty that the heavily produced main Petherick channel often lacked. It provided a grounded, deeply personal, unvarnished look at the emotional toll and the quiet triumphs of extreme renovation. Yanis would intersperse intense, exhausting time lapses of him installing drywall and skimming plaster with quiet, tender, silent moments caring for the estate's various rescue animals. He became an emotional anchor for the entire community. He was the everyman who was making good through sheer, unadulterated, stubborn persistence. He had successfully moved from a background character, quietly holding a tape measure, into a leading protagonist, carrying the immense narrative weight of a massive restoration dream. But while Yanis was quietly building a fiercely loyal following, building solid walls and building an entirely new life for himself away from the bars of Paris, the very foundation of the Petherick Empire was harboring a massive, incredibly dark secret. The wholesome, family-friendly, culturally appreciative narrative of the Chateauverse was entirely, fundamentally at odds with the disturbing reality of how Billy and Gwendoline had funded their early endeavors. Before the viral fame, before the romantic time lapses of historic preservation, and before the lucrative Patreon accounts, Billy Petherick was a fugitive from justice. He had illegally deserted his post in the British Army.
And while living under the radar in France, attempting to avoid military prosecution, he and Gwendoline engaged in a staggering, systematic, multi-year campaign of cultural property theft that would eventually destroy their public image. Between the years 2013 and 2014, long before they bought the chateau, the couple systematically targeted rural, completely unguarded historic churches across the quiet regions of Brittany and Mayenne. These were small, often impoverished local parishes that left their heavy wooden doors open during the day so elderly parishioners could step inside to pray in peace. Billy saw these open doors not as a beautiful testament to faith or community trust, but as a highly lucrative business opportunity. He would brazenly walk into these sacred, quiet spaces during normal operating hours, carrying a heavy metal crowbar. He would violently pry open locked wooden chests, forcefully destroy ancient tabernacles, and steal irreplaceable religious artifacts, including sacred chalices, brass keys, and ornate crosses. While he was inside physically desecrating these local historical monuments, Gwendoline sat outside parked in their luxury Porsche, acting as a lookout.
By her own astonishing later admission to a French court, she would sit comfortably in the expensive car, playing mindlessly on her phone and writing her university marketing dissertation, while her partner actively looted the church a few feet away. When later asked by baffled authorities to explain his actions, she simply offered the cold explanation that Billy did not have a high opinion of the church. Over the course of their spree, they stole roughly 80 priceless artifacts from over 40 different rural churches. They then fenced the stolen goods on eBay, selling off pieces of French heritage to the highest bidder to fund their lifestyle. It was a deeply cynical, highly coordinated, ruthless operation that completely contradicted the pristine image of the noble, history-loving restorers they later cultivated online for millions of adoring fans. For years, they actually got away with it. They bought the massive Chateau, successfully launched the YouTube channels, and became incredibly wealthy off the adulation of fans who genuinely believed they were financially supporting the noble preservation of European heritage. But the digital fame they so desperately chased and optimized eventually became their absolute undoing. In 2018, the couple agreed to be featured on a popular British television series called Escape to the Chateau DIY. Millions of people watched Billy casually redoing the mortar on a tall chimney. Someone connected to the British military happened to be watching the broadcast and instantly recognized the army deserter operating in plain sight on national television.
That shocking discovery eventually forced Billy back to the United Kingdom to face a formal military hearing, where he was formally discharged from the service. He remarkably managed to avoid a long, brutal prison sentence for desertion, largely by pointing to his new, highly publicized, seemingly stable life as a supposedly rehabilitated family man, passionately restoring a historic French chateau. He effectively used the digital empire, the massive audience support, and Gwendoline's immense inherited yeast wealth to shield himself from the harshest consequences of his military crimes. But the French authorities were not so easily deterred. They continued their meticulous investigation and eventually traced the illicit eBay sales back to the couple. In February 2024, a criminal court in Rennes finally brought the hammer down. Billy and Gwendoline were officially convicted for the extensive church thefts. Billy received a 12-month suspended prison sentence and a crushing €15,000 fine. Gwendoline was fined roughly €10,000 for her role in the operation. Even if you tried desperately to separate the criminal convictions from the day-to-day mortar-mixing reality of the convent renovation, you cannot possibly separate the massive fallout. The entire economy of the Chateauverse runs exclusively on trust.
It requires the audience to believe, on a deeply parasocial level, that the creators are genuinely good, honest people, doing something culturally significant and morally right. When the devastating news of the church lootings began to slowly circulate through the community forums, Reddit threads, and YouTube comment sections, that essential trust sustained a massive, fatal blow. You simply cannot ask ordinary people to crowdfund the restoration of a former religious convent when you have a recent criminal record for violently prying open church tabernacles with a crowbar. The intense pressure of the court case, combined with the crushing, overwhelming financial reality of the convent project, created an incredibly toxic, suffocating atmosphere behind the scenes. The convent was not a cute, manageable weekend project. It was a massive, terrifying financial liability. Everything in a building that old looks completely solid until you actually touch it with a hammer. The slate roofs hide extensive, dangerous rot. The thick oak floors hide severe structural sag. And every single routine repair uncovers 3 new, desperately expensive problems that require specialized labor. By late 2025, the cracks in the facade were becoming absolutely impossible to ignore. The posting schedule on the main Petherick channel, which had once been a reliable, steady, highly anticipated drumbeat of progress, went completely off the rails. Updates became erratic, highly anticipated drumbeat of progress went completely off the rails. Updates became erratic, then agonizingly sparse, and finally they just stopped altogether. Billy Petherick, the loud, confident, visionary driving force of the entire project, vanished from the frame entirely.
The heavy work on the Convent ground to a dead, silent, permanent halt. In an internet ecosystem where the fans are deeply, emotionally, and financially invested in the daily lives of the creators, a sudden lack of presence is incredibly loud. The viewers notice the bizarre silence immediately. On dedicated forums like Reddit's Château Unhinged, the amateur internet detectives went into absolute overdrive. People began forensically analyzing the background of old videos, checking local French property records, translating obscure local news articles, and piecing together small clues dropped by locals in the Mayenne region. The rumors began to swirl with ferocious, unchecked intensity. This was clearly not a minor creative dispute about what color to paint a hallway. The word on the street, eventually confirmed by the sheer, deafening absence of any counter-narrative, was that Billy and Gwendoline had split up in a spectacular, scorched-earth, immensely bitter fashion. The core romantic relationship that formed the very foundation of the renovation empire had violently collapsed. Because Gwendoline strategically held the deeds to both the Chateau and the Convent in her name, the breakup was not just a tragic personal matter, it was a brutal corporate dissolution. The fallout was swift, absolute, and utterly merciless.
Billy was reportedly kicked off the properties entirely. Just like that, the man who had meticulously built a massive digital brand around his carefully curated identity as the rugged lord of the manor, lost his sprawling home, his ambitious renovation projects, and his physical access to the very ancient walls he had built his entire reputation on. For the millions of fans, the sudden, unexplained disappearance of the Petherick family was jarring, but the real, palpable anxiety centered entirely on Yanis. He had been quietly, diligently working on his apartment in the convent, pouring his blood, sweat, and limited funds into a space he genuinely believed he would one day occupy. When the main channel went completely silent, Yanis also abruptly disappeared from YouTube for an agonizingly long period. The beloved, hard-working apprentice was suddenly caught completely exposed in the crossfire of a messy divorce he had absolutely nothing to do with. The audience was left to frantically wonder if he had been maliciously fired, if he had been forced to take a side in an impossible loyalty test, or if the entire convent project was simply dead in the water, taking his livelihood with it. When Yanis finally resurfaced in early 2026, the highly anticipated video he posted felt like a physical, sickening blow to the entire community. He was not standing joyfully inside his half-finished apartment, enthusiastically showing off freshly sanded floors or new drywall. He was standing outside, looking exhausted and defeated, delivering a raw, quiet, incredibly restrained update.
And in that update, he dropped a detail that was absolutely impossible for anyone to spin. He revealed, plainly, that he had been completely locked out of the convent. He mentioned that he had left his key in Paris, a polite, distinctly face-saving way of publicly acknowledging a brutal, undeniable reality. The heavy iron locks had been changed. The property was legally sealed. Being locked out was not a dramatic, symbolic gesture. It was a cold, concrete, devastating physical reality. It meant that the apartment renovation, a deeply personal project the viewers had watched him build literally from the rubble up over hundreds of hours of footage, was now completely inaccessible to him. His expensive tools were trapped inside. His painstaking work was inside. His immediate future as a digital creator was trapped behind a heavy wooden door that he was no longer legally permitted to open. This shocking revelation instantly transformed the vague, swirling internet rumors of a bad breakup into an undeniable, horrifying fact. It proved definitively that the bridges between Billy and Gwendoline had not just been burned, they had been heavily barricaded and guarded. Yanis, universally regarded as the hardest-working, most genuine guy on the channel, had been abruptly sidelined, physically displaced by the toxic, destructive fallout of a relationship he had zero control over.
The fans were absolutely furious. They watched a man who had given the best years of his life to these crumbling properties, effectively thrown out into the cold because the wealthy owners couldn't keep their chaotic personal lives together. But Yanis, displaying a level of maturity rarely seen online, did not use his massive platform to angrily lash out. His comeback video was an absolute masterclass in extreme restraint and calculated public relations. He did not yell, he did not hurl accusations, and he did not air the messy, humiliating dirty laundry of his former employees. Instead, he carefully, deliberately mapped out the stark new boundaries of his reality for the audience to see. In that same pivotal video, Yanis made it very, very clear exactly where his future lay. He was highly vocal, repetitive, and deeply emotional in his profound gratitude toward Gwendoline. He thanked her profusely for throwing him a desperately needed lifeline when he was drowning. Recognizing his intense loyalty, his unmatched work ethic, and the sheer, staggering unfairness of his situation, Gwendoline had officially stepped in and hired Yanis to work for her directly. She provided him with a brand new, fully funded project completely separate from the toxic, legally fraught baggage of the convent. She tasked him with restoring a beautiful, dilapidated cottage on her extensive grounds, intending to eventually turn it into a high-end holiday let. By emphatically emphasizing Gwen's crucial support, Yanis subtly signaled exactly where his loyalties now firmly resided. He was anchoring his survival, both financial and digital, to the woman who actually owned the land. The woman who had ensured he didn't lose his entire livelihood when the YouTube empire suddenly crumbled to dust. But the most powerful, resonant part of Yanis's return was not what he said. It was what he pointedly, deliberately didn't say. Throughout the entire emotional update, the total absence of Billy Petherick's name was deafening. For a creator whose solo career was literally, undeniably launched by Billy handing him a camera and encouraging him to film, the lack of even a perfunctory nod of thanks suggested a rupture far too deep, far too painful for public politeness. In a normal, amicable transition, you would always expect a brief, standard acknowledgement, something simple like acknowledging the things have changed, thanking Billy for the initial start, and moving on. Yanis offered absolutely nothing. The omission was surgical, precise, and completely intentional. Without ever publishing an official, dramatic breakup announcement or a tearful sit-down video, Yanis successfully drew a massive, uncrossable line in the sand. He was communicating clearly to his audience that he was no longer a subordinate member of the Petherick creative orbit.
He was now an independent entity, fully backed by the yeast heiress, and completely, permanently severed from the man who used to direct his every move. This decisive pivot sent immediate shockwaves through the rest of the deeply entangled Petherick family structure. The entire social architecture of the estate was collapsing in real time, visible to anyone paying attention. Billy's brother, Michael Petherick, whose own massive channel, Doing It Ourselves, was heavily tied to the Chateau's ecosystem, had to rapidly distance his content from the properties owned by Gwendoline. Sadie Petherick reportedly packed up her life and returned to the United Kingdom. The entire extended family, which had operated seamlessly as a massive, interconnected content farm, living rent-free on Gwen's vast land, was effectively permanently banished. The golden era of the Petherick dynasty at the Château was definitively dead. if Yanis provided the quiet, dignified subtext of the breakup, it was someone entirely unexpected who provided the explosive, definitive text. In the highly manufactured world of YouTube production, there is exactly one person who sees absolutely everything without a filter: the cameraman. The cameraman is the ultimate invisible fly on the wall. They are physically present for the raw tensions, the off-camera moods, the snapped insults, the exhausted breakdowns, and the quiet cruelty that never, ever makes the final, polished, algorithm-friendly cut.
Shortly after Yanis posted his highly scrutinized update, Alex the cameraman, a seasoned professional from Tomco Media who'd spent countless grueling hours filming the crew in the freezing French mud, stepped out from behind the safety of the lens. He boldly waded into the volatile comment section of Yanis's video and dropped a blunt statement that acted as the final, undeniable tectonic shift for the massive audience. Alex wrote, and I quote, "Yanis, you are the most loyal, gentle, genuine, and hardworking guy I know. You deserve the same respect back and not how you have been treated." He didn't stop there. He added, "Everyone is behind you. There's a reason Gwendoline sees you for who you are and will support you, the same way you do her and her family." In the highly curated, deeply manicured, aggressively legally conscious world of digital creators, a comment exactly like that from a core production team member is a massive, unprecedented breach of protocol. It was a loud, public declaration of factional alignment. By publicly praising Yanis as genuine and explicitly stating he did not deserve how he had been treated, Alex implicitly but undeniably framed the opposing side, Billy Petherick, as the primary aggressor. He permanently turned what could have eventually been spun as a simple professional parting of ways into a profound, highly emotional moral dispute.
And the guy physically holding the camera tells the audience that the star of the show has been treating the apprentice terribly behind closed doors. The audience listens immediately. It gave the millions of viewers total, unreserved permission to stop treating the situation as mere internet gossip and start treating it as a documented, painful reality. It pointed directly to a deep, lingering hurt, a version of events where Yanis was severely exploited, sidelined, or mistreated by the very man who loudly claimed to be his generous mentor. Before the community could even fully process the sheer gravity of that public outcry, the comment was swiftly deleted. The video itself was briefly removed from the platform. The frantic, desperate digital scrubbing by those trying to control the narrative only confirmed what everyone already knew in their gut. The cozy, idyllic narrative was a complete lie. The cameraman had shattered the fourth wall, and the truth that spilled out was ugly, painful, and absolutely impossible to put back in the box. The massive fallout from that specific moment permanently altered the entire landscape of the Chateauverse. The upheaval predictably split the massive, once unified fan base into three distinct, highly aggressive camps. First, there are the Yanis loyalists. These are the viewers who clearly see a hard-working, thoroughly decent young man handling a terrifying, career-ending power struggle with immense restraint and quiet dignity. They are fully invested in his new Cottage project, thrilled that he survived the brutal purge and eager to watch him succeed on his own merits. Opposite them are the hardcore Petherick traditionalists. These are the fans who remain blindly, stubbornly loyal to Billy out of a long-standing parasocial attachment. They constantly argue in forums that the full story remains untold, or they view Yanis's crucial alignment with Gwendoline as a treacherous betrayal of the man who first gave him a camera. And finally, there are the exhausted. These are the viewers who simply came to YouTube after a long day of work to watch someone carefully sand a piece of vintage French oak and apply a nice even coat of varnish. They came purely for escapism. Now they find themselves parsing complicated French property deeds, analyzing comment section diplomacy, and studying the criminal history of military deserters as if they are actively preparing for a grueling law exam. The innocence of the genre is entirely, permanently gone. In the bitter aftermath, Billy Petherick has attempted a massive, desperate career pivot. Stripped entirely of his majestic chateau and his massive convent, he has shifted his content entirely away from the French countryside.
He is now documenting the slow restoration of a boat formerly owned by Frank Sinatra.
It is a transient, floating, highly precarious project, one that stands in sharp, almost ironic, painful contrast to the grounded, centuries-old permanence of the heavy stone walls he was legally forced to leave behind. He has been rapidly, frantically rebranding his channels, suppressing older, highly viewed content, and attempting to meticulously scrub the digital footprint of his decade-long reign over Gwendoline's vast properties. Yanis, against absolutely all odds, has navigated this catastrophic, career-threatening shakeup with surprising, quiet resilience. He instinctively understands the cardinal rule of digital survival. As long as the story moves forward, the audience will follow. He is keeping his head down. He is keeping his hands dirty. By focusing entirely on the detailed cottage renovation, he has maintained the exact momentum necessary to keep his channel alive and thriving. He is no longer orbiting the toxic gravity of the Petherick family. He is the sole, undisputed architect of his own digital future, fully funded by the yeast heiress and completely free from the suffocating shadow of his former mentor. Yet, despite his incredible individual survival, there is a lingering, undeniable tragedy to the whole sprawling saga. The Chateauverse, as millions once knew it, will never be the same. The physical residue of this epic collapse is scattered across the cold Mayenne countryside. The massive convent stands mostly silent now, its heavy doors locked.
The unfinished rooms, the interrupted, ambitious plans, the expensive tools left behind, they stand as haunting, expansive monuments to a social architecture that simply no longer exists. For the millions of fans who invested years of their lives and countless dollars in ad revenue and Patreon subscriptions into watching these historic spaces transform, this is infinitely more than just internet gossip. It is the sudden, painful death of a long-term emotional investment. The interconnected, seemingly wholesome world they thought they deeply understood has been brutally revealed to be highly conditional, built entirely on fractured relationships, hidden crimes, and a deeply precarious, imbalanced power dynamic. What makes the story of Yanis so incredibly compelling and so vital to understand is that it forcefully pulls back the heavy curtain on a reality that viewers desperately want to ignore. Beneath the calming aesthetic time lapses and the rustic sun-drenched charm lies a volatile, explosive mix of unregulated labor, financial inequity, and toxic interpersonal dependency. The beautiful dream of bringing a massive, broken old building back to life is incredibly fragile. It relies entirely on people treating each other with basic human respect behind closed doors. When that respect vanishes, the money stops, the cameras turn off, and the walls stop going up.
Through all the wreckage, the drama, and the deleted comments, Yanis has undergone his most significant, impressive transformation yet. He is no longer the humble, exhausted bartender dropping in for a weekend visit. He is no longer the diligent, quiet apprentice standing silently in the background, waiting for instructions. He has forcefully emerged as the defining, central figure of the Chateauverse's most dramatic, painful chapter. He is a survivor standing tall among the absolute ruins of a collapsed digital narrative, carefully picking up his trowel and quietly deciding to build something entirely new. If you found this story compelling, send it to a friend who appreciates the messy reality hiding behind perfectly curated lives.